The year was 1884, and the land was a cruel altar upon which the sun sacrificed the sky each day, bleeding heat onto the cracked earth. For Eleanor Vance, the cruelty was not confined to the landscape. It rode beside her, wore a man's face, and answered to the name of her husband, Garrett. Their wagon, a vessel of dwindling hope, had finally surrendered, its axles split like a dry bone. They were stranded in the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Arizona Territory, miles from any settlement they could name. Useless, Garrett had snarled, kicking the splintered wheel. The word was not for the wagon. It was for her. It was always for her. For 2 years his love had curdled into a possessive contempt that clung to her like the dust. He blamed her for the failed venture in Prescott, for the lame horse, for the relentless sun itself. Eleanor had learned to absorb the venom of his words, to build a small, quiet space inside herself where he could not reach. She stood a little ways off, her calico dress faded and sticking to her skin, her gaze fixed on the shimmering horizon. Thirst was a living thing in her throat. Garrett had been rationing the water for 3 days, his sips long and mocking, hers barely enough to wet her lips. He watched her now, his eyes narrowed slits in his sunburnt face. Don't just stand there like a half-wit. Make yourself useful. Find some brush for a fire. Not that there's anything left to cook. Obedience was a reflex, a mechanism for survival. Eleanor turned from the ruin of their wagon and walked toward a sparse gathering of mesquite and brittlebush. The ground radiated heat through the thin soles of her boots. The silence out here was profound, broken only by the buzz of an unseen insect and the rustle of her own skirts against the scrub. It was in this silence that she allowed herself a flicker of a forbidden thought. Freedom, a life where the only harshness was the sun, the only judgment, the vastness of the sky. She bent to pick up a piece of dried mesquite, her fingers brushing against the hot, sandy soil. As she straightened, a movement at the edge of her vision, coiled and tight, drew her eye. Before a coherent thought could form, before a scream could build in her lungs, there was a sharp, piercing pain in her left ankle. It was a pain like 2 needles of fire being driven into her flesh. She stumbled back, a choked cry escaping her lips, and looked down. A diamond-patterned snake, its rattle a furious, dry hiss, was already slithering away into the meager shade of a rock. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She clutched her ankle, a wave of nausea rolling through her. The 2 small puncture wounds were already beginning to weep a thin, clear fluid. Garrett. Her voice was thin, stolen by terror. Garrett, help me. He came jogging over, his expression one of annoyance rather than concern. What is it now, woman? Seen a ghost? She pointed a trembling finger at her leg. A snake. It bit me. Garrett stopped. He stared down at her ankle, his eyes tracing the faint wounds. For a long moment, he said nothing. Eleanor watched his face, searching for any sign of alarm, of husbandly duty, of simple human pity. She found none. Instead, a slow, calculating stillness settled over his features. The annoyance was gone, replaced by something she had never seen before, something cold and appraising. It was the look of a man weighing an opportunity. "A rattler?" he asked, his voice strangely calm. She nodded, tears finally breaking free and tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Please, Garrett, you have to do something. Cut it, suck the poison." She was babbling the half-remembered remedies she'd heard men discuss. He looked from her ankle to the endless, empty horizon and then back to her face. A slow, cruel smile touched the corner of his mouth. It did not reach his eyes. "I suppose I could," he said softly. He then knelt, but not to help her. He reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the small silver locket her mother had given her, his only concession to her sentimentality. He pocketed it. "What are you doing?" she whispered, a new, more profound horror dawning. Garrett stood up, dusting off his knees. "You've been nothing but a millstone around my neck, Eleanor, a bad luck charm." I figure this is the land's way of finally cutting me loose." He walked back to the wagon, gathered the last canteen of water and the small sack of their remaining funds. He didn't even glance back. "Garrett, no," she screamed, the sound raw and desperate. "You can't just leave me, Garrett." He didn't falter. He simply began walking east, his figure shrinking against the enormity of the landscape until he was just a dark speck, and then nothing at all. The silence he left behind was heavier than before, filled with the frantic drumming of her own heart and the furious rising throb in her leg. The sun beat down, indifferent. The land held its breath. Eleanor Vance was alone, left to die. Amos Blackwood understood the language of solitude. It was spoken in the cry of a hawk circling his isolated ranch, in the sigh of the wind through the eaves of his small cabin, in the weary creak of his own bones at the end of a long day. For 5 years, since consumption had stolen his Martha, silence had been his only steady companion. His life was a set of rigid routines: mend the fence, check the well, tend the stock. It was a life walled in by memory and loss, and he had long ago accepted its quiet austerity. He was riding the southern line of his property, tracking a calf that had wandered off, when he saw her. She was not a part of the landscape he knew. He first mistook her for a strange, crumpled shadow beneath a palo verde tree. Curiosity, a feeling he rarely indulged, pulled him closer. It was a woman, sprawled on the ground, one arm flung over her face as if to ward off the brutal sun. He dismounted, his movements cautious. Bandits sometimes used decoys, but as he drew near, he saw the unnatural stillness of her form, the way her dress was torn and stained with dirt. Her face, when he gently moved her arm, was pale and clammy, her lips tinged with blue. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. His gaze traveled down her body and stopped at her left leg. It was grotesquely swollen, the flesh angry and discolored, a violent purple that crept past her knee. And there, on her ankle, he saw them. The 2 dark punctures, the unmistakable signature of a Crotalus. He felt a jolt, a surge of something that broke through the calm surface of his solitude. It was a feeling of urgent, protective fury. Fury at the snake, at the merciless land, at whoever had left her here to suffer this fate. There was no time for deliberation. He knew the folk remedies were a desperate gamble, a prayer against a potent poison, but they were the only prayer he had. Working with a grim economy of motion, he pulled the Bowie knife from the sheath on his belt. The steel was cool and familiar in his hand. He knelt beside her, his heart pounding a heavy, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. He whispered an apology to the unconscious woman, or perhaps to the memory of his wife, before making 2 small, shallow cuts over the bite marks, just enough to break the skin. He lowered his head, pressed his mouth to her flesh, and drew. The taste was acrid, metallic, vile. He spat the venom-laced blood onto the parched ground, the glob turning dark in the dust. He repeated the action, again and again, his mind a blank slate of pure, desperate focus. He worked until his own head swam, until the poison he tasted was a phantom on his tongue. He knew it wasn't a cure, it was just a chance, a flicker of light against an encroaching darkness. When he could do no more, he rinsed his mouth with the last of the water from his canteen, pouring a few precious drops over her cracked lips. She moaned, a sound so faint it was nearly lost to the wind. With a strength born of necessity, he lifted her. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile burden. He settled her in front of him on the saddle, her head lolling against his chest, and turned his horse, spurring it toward the distant silhouette of his cabin. It was a race against the poison, against the sun, against the death that was already staking its claim on the woman in his arms. For 3 days, the world was a fever dream of fragmented images and disembodied sounds for Eleanor. She was burning, adrift on a sea of fire. She felt cool cloths on her forehead, the gentle pressure of a spoon at her lips, the taste of thin, savory broth. A deep voice murmured nearby, words she couldn't grasp, but the tone was steady, a low anchor in the storm of her delirium. She mumbled about Garrett, about a broken wagon, about the coldness in his eyes. She cried out at the memory of the snake, her body jerking with phantom pain. Through it all, Amos was a constant, tireless presence. He moved about the small two-room cabin with a quiet efficiency. He brewed willow bark tea to fight the fever. He bathed her swollen leg in cool water, changing the poultices of crushed herbs he prepared from Martha's old garden. He sat by her cot through the long nights, watching the rise and fall of her chest, his own exhaustion a dull ache behind his eyes. He listened to her fevered ramblings and felt a slow-burning anger solidify in his gut. The name Garrett became synonymous with a kind of evil he could barely comprehend. On the morning of the fourth day, the fever broke. Eleanor awoke to the scent of wood smoke and coffee. Her mind felt clear, scoured clean, but her body was a territory of profound weakness. She turned her head and saw him. He was standing by the stone fireplace, his back to her, a broad-shouldered silhouette against the morning light. He was stirring something in a pot. She tried to speak, but her voice was a dry rasp. "Hello?" He turned, startled. His face was weathered, carved with lines of sun and sorrow, but his eyes were a clear, steady grey. They held a guarded kindness. He walked over to the cot, a cup of water in his hand. "Easy now," he said, his voice the same low rumble she'd heard in her dreams. He helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. "You've had a rough go of it." She drank the water greedily. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. She looked down at her leg, propped on a stool. The swelling had gone down, though the skin was still a mottled canvas of purple and yellow bruises. The wound on her ankle was clean, bandaged with a strip of white cloth. You found me." "By the palo verde tree," he confirmed, his gaze direct. "Rattler got you." The memory washed over her, sharp and terrible. Garrett's face, the glint of the sun on the stolen locket, his back as he walked away. A sob caught in her throat. She pressed her lips together, fighting it back. She would not cry in front of this stranger. She had no tears left. He seemed to understand. He didn't press her for details. He simply nodded toward the fireplace. "Broth is ready. You need to get your strength back." And so began their quiet coexistence. Her world shrank to the four walls of his cabin and the small patch of ground visible from the window. The man, Amos Blackwood, was a creature of few words. Their conversations were sparse, functional exchanges about food, water, and her recovery. He would tell her, "Leg looks better today," and she would reply, "It feels it." He'd leave a bowl of stew on the small table by her cot and retreat to the other side of the room, giving her space. Yet, in his silence, there was a profound language of care. He had mended the tear in her dress with small, clumsy stitches. He left a book of poems by Martha's side of the bed for her to read. He never once made her feel like a burden. He treated her with a deep, almost formal respect that was so alien to her, it felt like a dream. As her strength returned, Eleanor began to take tentative steps, first around the cabin, then out onto the porch. She watched him work. He moved with a kind of deep-rooted competence, his hands sure as he repaired a harness or chopped wood. He was a man who belonged to this land, who understood its rhythms and demands. He was the complete antithesis of Garrett, who had only ever sought to conquer and exploit it, and had failed at both. One afternoon, she found the courage to contribute. She took the basket of his mending and sat on the porch, her needle moving with a practiced skill that surprised even her. He returned from the fields, stopped on the steps, and simply watched her for a moment. "My Martha," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She could mend anything, seemed to think she could mend the whole world with a needle and thread. It was the first time he had spoken of his wife by name, the first crack in the wall of his solitude. Eleanor looked up from her work, meeting his gaze. "It's a good skill to have," she said quietly. Some things need mending." He nodded, a flicker of understanding passing between them. He sat on the step below her, the silence stretching out, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty, it was shared. The fragile bridge of trust, built plank by plank with quiet gestures and unspoken empathy, was beginning to feel solid beneath their feet. Weeks turned into a month. The bruises on Eleanor's leg faded to a pale yellow, and she could walk without a limp. The ranch became her sanctuary, a place of healing. She took over the cooking, her meals a small offering of gratitude. She tended the small vegetable patch Martha had planted, coaxing green life from the dry soil. She and Amos fell into a comfortable domestic rhythm, a partnership forged in the ashes of their separate griefs. The memory of Garrett receded, becoming a ghost story she told only to herself in the dead of night. She began to feel a sense of home, a feeling she realized she had never truly known. It wasn't in the walls of the cabin, but in the steadfast presence of the man who occupied it with her, in the safety she felt when his shadow fell across the doorway at dusk. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky bruise into nightfall, she finally found the words. "He left me to die," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband. He saw the bite and he just walked away." Amos didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the horizon, his jaw tight. "I figured as much," he said, his voice a low growl. "Some men aren't men at all." He was silent for a long time. Then he turned to her, his grey eyes holding hers. "He won't ever hurt you again. I won't let him." It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a statement of fact, a promise. And in the vast, quiet expanse of the West, under a canopy of 1,000,000 stars, Eleanor believed him. She had been found not just in the desert, but in the quiet heart of a good man. The peace they had cultivated was as fragile as a desert bloom. It was shattered one hot Tuesday by the arrival of a buggy, kicking up a plume of dust that was visible for miles. Amos saw it first from the barn. His body went rigid. Visitors were a rarity. Unannounced visitors were a threat. He walked toward the cabin, his hand resting near the Colt Peacemaker on his hip. Eleanor came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her face etched with a familiar dread. As the buggy drew closer, she recognized the man holding the reins. It was Mr. Shaw, the sheriff from Jericho, the nearest town, some 30 miles east, and sitting beside him, looking smug and proprietary, was Garrett Vance. The sight of him stole the air from her lungs. He looked cleaner, better fed. He wore a new shirt. He had clearly prospered from her death. A cold fury, an emotion she had suppressed for years, rose up in her. The buggy stopped. Sheriff Shaw, a portly man with a weary expression, climbed down. "Amos," he said with a nod. His eyes flickered to Eleanor, a hint of confusion in them. Garrett disembarked with a flourish, a practiced smile plastered on his face. "Eleanor, my love, my darling wife, thank God you are safe." He started toward the porch, his arms outstretched. Amos moved without thinking, placing himself between Garrett and the steps. "That's far enough, Vance." Garrett's smile tightened. "Mr. Blackwood, I am in your debt. As I told the sheriff, I was attacked by Apaches. I was knocked unconscious and left for dead. When I came to, my wagon was gone, my wife vanished. I have spent weeks searching for her, fearing the worst." His performance was seamless, his voice filled with feigned relief and sorrow. "He's lying," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady, clear, imbued with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She looked directly at the sheriff. "There were no Apaches. My husband abandoned me after I was bitten by a rattlesnake. He left me to die." The sheriff looked from Eleanor's resolute face to Garrett's indignant one. "Now, ma'am," he began, clearly uncomfortable. "That's a serious accusation. Your husband here registered you as deceased. He seemed mighty broken up about it." "He is a fine actor," Eleanor stated flatly. "Ask him where my mother's locket is, the one he took from my pocket as I lay on the ground, dying." Garrett's mask of civility began to crack. A vein pulsed in his temple. "She's delirious," "The fever, Sheriff, it's addled her mind. This man has clearly taken advantage of her condition. She is my wife. By law, she belongs with me, and I am here to take her home." He made a move to push past Amos, to grab Eleanor's arm. Amos didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. He simply stood his ground, an immovable object. His body was tense, a coiled spring of protective instinct, but his voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "She's not going anywhere with you." The three words hung in the hot, still air. They were a line drawn in the dust, a declaration of war. "She is my property," Garrett snarled, his true nature finally erupting through the veneer of charm. "The law says so." "The law doesn't give a man the right to leave his wife for buzzard food," Amos countered, his grey eyes like chips of flint. "You can tell the sheriff whatever story you want, but you will not lay a hand on her. You will not take her from this place." The confrontation had reached its peak. It was not a battle of guns, but of wills. Sheriff Shaw looked at Eleanor, standing tall and defiant on the porch, her gaze unwavering. He looked at Garrett, his face twisted with rage and thwarted possession. And he looked at Amos Blackwood, a quiet, solitary man who was now willing to stand against the law, and a dangerous man for the sake of this woman. The truth of the situation settled in his gut, heavy and undeniable. "Vance," the sheriff said, his voice taking on a new, hard edge. "Mr. Blackwood is right. You'll not be taking her. In fact, I think you and I need to have a long talk about filing a false report, and fraud, and maybe attempted murder." The color drained from Garrett's face. The fight went out of him, replaced by the panicked look of a cornered rat. He stammered, protested, but the sheriff was resolute. The law, which Garrett had tried to use as his weapon, had turned against him. He was escorted back to the buggy, his threats and curses fading as the vehicle turned and retreated down the long, dusty track, disappearing the same way it had arrived. Silence descended once more upon the ranch, but it was a new kind of silence, cleansed and peaceful. The threat was gone. Eleanor slowly sank onto the porch step, the strength that had held her up finally giving way to a profound sense of relief. Amos turned and sat beside her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid, comforting weight. They sat for a long time, watching the dust settle, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch reasserting themselves. "It's over," she said, more to herself than to him. "Yes," he agreed. She looked at her hands, resting in her lap. They were no longer the hands of the woman Garrett had tried to break. They were strong, capable, stained with the good earth from Martha's garden. She looked up at Amos. His face was calm, the tension gone, but his eyes held a question. The question of what came next. "Amos," she began, her voice soft, "I have nowhere to go." "I know," he said. He finally looked at her, and in his gaze she saw the depth of his loneliness and the hope that had begun to take root there. "Eleanor," he said, speaking her name as if it were a prayer. "You don't need somewhere to go. You're already home." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of gratitude. She reached out, her hand tentatively covering his. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was gentle as he turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The harsh land, the place of her abandonment and near death, had become a place of rebirth. In the heart of its unforgiving beauty, two solitary souls, scarred by their pasts, had found not just survival, but sanctuary. They had found it in the shared quiet, in the steadfast care, and in the simple, profound truth of a hand held in the fading light. They had found it in each other. The year was 1886, and the silence of the Dakota prairie was a living thing. For Isaac Prescott, it was his only constant companion. It had weight, pressing in on him from the vast, bruised sky and rising from the unforgiving soil of his homestead. His world was one of hard lines. The sharp horizon, the rigid furrows he plowed, the stark frame of the house he'd built with hands that now felt like blunt, clumsy tools. Inside that house, the silence was deeper still, a hollow echo of a life that had been stolen from him 5 winters past. Grief was a tenant that paid no rent. It had moved in the day he buried Mary and their infant son, and it had never left. It occupied her chair at the small kitchen table. It slept in the cold half of his bed. It looked back at him from his own reflection, carving his face into a mask of stoic resignation. At 34, Isaac had the eyes of an old man, weary and washed out, the color of the sky just before a storm. He worked from before the sun rose until his muscles screamed in protest, a punishing routine designed to leave him too exhausted for thought, too broken for memory. But memory was a stubborn weed, always finding a crack to push through. His farm was his penance and his prison. 160 acres of isolation, purchased with hope and now tilled with a kind of grim duty. The house was sturdy, the barn sound, the fences straight. It was a testament to his capability, a place of order and function, but it was not a home. A home had warmth, it had laughter, it had a future. Isaac's house had only the past, preserved like a dead butterfly under glass. Mary's sewing basket still sat by the hearth, a fine layer of dust on the lid. The cradle he had carved sat in the corner of their bedroom, a silent wooden accusation. He spoke more to his horse, a stoic gelding named Pate, than he did to any human. Trips to the small, windswept town of Providence were rare and purely functional. He'd trade his grain, buy salt, coffee and flour, and endure the veiled, pitying looks from the townsfolk. They saw a man haunted and broken by tragedy, a man who had pulled so far into himself he had nearly disappeared. They whispered about him, the lonely farmer out on the Blackwood stretch. It was Walter Henderson, the owner of the town's mercantile and its chief gossip, who had planted the seed. "A man ain't meant to be alone, Isaac," he'd said one day, leaning over the counter, his voice slick with false concern. "This land will swallow you whole if you let it. You need a wife, a helpmeet." Isaac had merely grunted, his gaze fixed on the sack of oats he was hoisting onto his shoulder. But Henderson persisted, week after week. He spoke of mail-order brides, of decent women looking for a steady husband and a new life. The idea, at first, was repulsive. A stranger in Mary's house, a woman trying to fill a space that was not empty, but sacredly occupied by a ghost. Yet the loneliness was a physical ache, a cold that settled deep in his bones, one that even the summer sun couldn't seem to warm. One day, beaten down by the sheer weight of his solitude, he had listened. Henderson showed him an advertisement, a clipping from an Eastern newspaper. A respectable woman of good character, seeking a husband. The description was simple, modest. Isaac, in a moment of profound weakness he would later curse, had given Henderson the money to send a reply, along with the fare for a train ticket. He had done it, and then promptly tried to forget it, pushing the entire transaction into the back of his mind like a shameful secret. He expected nothing. It was easier that way. So when the letter came weeks later, announcing her imminent arrival, a strange, unfamiliar flutter of something akin to panic and hope stirred in his chest. He spent a week in a fugue state, cleaning the house with a frantic energy he hadn't felt in years. He aired out Mary's room, his hands shaking as he changed the linens on the bed. He scrubbed floors, mended a loose shutter, and even bought a small tin of lemon candies, something Mary had liked. He was preparing for an invasion, a disruption he both craved and dreaded. He told himself he was just being practical. He needed help. That was all. He was not looking to replace Mary. He was just trying to survive. The day came, a Tuesday. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue. Isaac hitched Pate to the wagon and made the long, dusty ride into Providence. He felt a fool. He felt like a man walking to his own execution. He stood on the platform of the small depot, his hat pulled low, watching the train spew black smoke as it approached, a monstrous black serpent slithering across the plains. He was expecting one woman, a single, solitary figure to match his own. The train hissed to a stop. A few passengers disembarked. A salesman with a waxed mustache, a family with 3 boisterous children, and then, them, 3 of them. They descended the steps of the passenger car one by one, a slow procession of dark wool and weary determination. They were sisters. That was clear from the shared features. The same dark, curly hair pinned up beneath sensible bonnets, the same guarded look in their eyes. They were also, all 3 of them, women of a size Isaac had never seen before. They were not just sturdy or stout. They were truly, undeniably large, their frames broad, their presence on the narrow platform immense and overwhelming. Isaac's mind went blank. He stared, unable to process the scene. 1 woman he had braced himself for. 3 was an impossibility, a catastrophe. They stood together, a small, defiant island, in a sea of gawking stares from the few people lingering at the station. The eldest, a woman with a face that held both strength and deep-seated weariness, held a single carpet bag. The other 2 stood slightly behind her, their hands clasped together. Suddenly, a bray of laughter cut through the air. It was Henderson, standing by the door of his mercantile, his face red with mirth. He caught Isaac's eye and gave him a grotesque wink. The truth crashed down on Isaac with the force of a physical blow. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a joke, a cruel, public, and humiliating prank designed by a mean-spirited man. They had sent him 3 obese sisters as a mail-order bride joke, and the whole town was here to watch the punchline. His blood ran cold, then hot with a fury so potent it made his vision swim. The eldest sister's gaze met his. There was no pleading in her eyes, only a sort of braced dignity, as if she had been standing on platforms like this, under the weight of scornful eyes, her entire life. In that moment, Isaac was faced with a choice that felt as vast and profound as the prairie itself. He could turn his back. He could leave them there to Henderson's jeers and the town's contempt, to be shipped back to wherever they came from like unwanted freight. Or he could walk toward them. He felt the town's eyes on him, hungry for the spectacle. He felt Henderson's triumphant smirk. He thought of his own crushing loneliness, the silent house, the ghost of his wife. And then he looked at the 3 women, at their exhaustion, their fear, and the fierce, protective way they stood together. He saw not a joke, but a reflection of his own isolation. They were outcasts, just as he was. Slowly, deliberately, Isaac Prescott moved. He ignored Henderson. He ignored the whispers. He walked across the dusty space that separated them and stopped a few feet before the eldest sister. He took off his hat, his hands stiff and awkward. "I am Isaac Prescott," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You have had a long journey. The wagon is this way." He did not offer a smile. He did not offer any explanation. He simply turned and led the way, leaving the laughter and the judgment to fade behind them. For the first time in 5 years, Isaac had made a decision that was not about the past, but about the immediate, terrifying present. He had no idea what he was doing or what would come of it. But as he helped the first sister up onto the wagon bench, her hand surprisingly firm in his, he knew he could not have done anything else. The silence in his wagon on the ride back to the farm was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the breathing of 4 strangers, bound together by a cruel prank and an uncertain future. The ride back to the homestead was a study in strained silence. Isaac kept his eyes fixed on Pate's steady gait, the muscles in his jaw tight. Beside him on the bench, the eldest sister sat ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap. In the back of the wagon, her 2 sisters huddled together amidst the few crates and bags that constituted their worldly possessions. The prairie stretched out around them, immense and indifferent. To Isaac, it had always been a symbol of his solitude. Now, he wondered what it looked like to them. These women from the crowded East. Did they see beauty or only a terrifying emptiness? He felt their presence as a physical weight, a disruption of the very air he breathed. His mind raced, a chaotic jumble of practical problems and profound dread. 3 of them. Where would they sleep? What would they eat? The advertisement had been a lie, a fiction woven by Henderson to humiliate him. What had they been told? What promises had been made to them, only to be broken on this desolate train platform? He felt a surge of anger at Henderson, so sharp and clean, it was almost a relief after years of dull, aching grief. But anger wouldn't solve the immediate crisis sitting in his wagon. When they finally crested the last rise and the farm came into view, the small, sturdy house, the larger barn, the corrals looking like an intricate sketch against the vast landscape, he heard a small intake of breath from one of the sisters in the back. He couldn't tell if it was a gasp of disappointment or relief. He pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard, the dust settling around them like a fine, brown shroud. For a long moment, nobody moved. The engine of the train was a distant memory. Out here, the only sounds were the sigh of the wind through the tall grass and the jingle of Pate's harness. Finally, Isaac turned to the woman beside him. He began, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? This was all a terrible mistake. You were sent here as a joke? The cruelty of it stuck in his craw. She saved him from having to speak. She turned her head, and for the first time he saw her eyes clearly. They were a deep, intelligent brown, and they held no illusions. I am Esther Donovan, she said, her voice low and steady. These are my sisters, Matilda and Beatrice. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the homestead, taking in its stark neatness. The advertisement was for a single bride, Mr. Prescott. We are aware of the discrepancy. Isaac was taken aback by her directness. He had expected tears, accusations, hysterics. Instead, he was met with a quiet, powerful dignity that shamed his own panicked silence. The advertisement was a lie, he managed to say, the words feeling inadequate. It was a prank by a man in town. Esther's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something resignation perhaps burst through her eyes. It was a look that said she was not at all surprised that cruelty was at the root of their situation. I see, she said softly. Behind her, the sister named Matilda, who had a round, placid face, put a comforting hand on the arm of the youngest, Beatrice, whose eyes were wide with a fear she wasn't trying to hide. You have no obligation to us, Esther continued, her voice firm, as if reciting a speech she had prepared. If you will allow us to rest for the night, we can make our own arrangements in the morning. Isaac looked at them, really looked at them. 3 women, alone, with a few bags and no money, in a town where they had already been marked as objects of ridicule. Make their own arrangements. The words were a hollow absurdity. Where would they go? What would they do? He saw Henderson's leering face in his mind's eye, and his decision, made instinctively at the train station, solidified into something hard and unmovable in his chest. No, he said, the single word sharp in the quiet air. He got down from the wagon and walked to the back, lowering the tailgate. You'll stay. He didn't look at them, focusing instead on their luggage. The house is small, but you'll be safe here. He led them inside. The house smelled of dust and old sorrow. To Isaac it was familiar. To them it must have felt like a tomb. He watched as they took it in, the simple, worn furniture, the clean but threadbare rug, the cold, cavernous hearth. Their presence seemed to suck the emptiness from the rooms, filling the space with a nervous, crackling energy. The immediate problem was sleeping. There was his room, and a small study that held a narrow cot he sometimes used when the memories in the bedroom grew too loud. Without a word, he went into the bedroom, Mary's bedroom, and began stripping the quilt from the bed. "What are you doing?" Esther's voice was sharp with alarm. "This is your room," he said, not looking at her. He pulled the sheets from the mattress, his movements stiff. The scent of lavender, faint and ancient, rose from the linens, a ghost of a scent that pierced him to the core. "It's the only bed big enough." "We cannot take your bed, Mr. Prescott," she insisted. "You will," he said, his back to them. "I'll sleep in the study. There's a cot." He piled the old linens in his arms and walked out, brushing past them. It was not an act of kindness, it was an act of sheer, desperate practicality. And yet, as he deposited the linens in the laundry basket, he knew he had just surrendered the last bastion of his grief. He had let strangers into the most sacred, painful room in his house. The thought left him feeling strangely hollowed out, but also, terrifyingly, a little bit lighter. That first evening was a collection of awkward, disconnected moments. Isaac showed them the water pump and the privy, his explanations clipped and functional. He built a fire in the hearth, the flames pushing back the encroaching chill of the evening. He felt clumsy and large in his own home, unsure of where to stand or what to do with his hands. The sisters communicated in low murmurs and glances, a silent language he could not decipher. Esther, the clear leader, moved with a quiet efficiency, assessing the kitchen as if it were a tactical position. Matilda, the middle sister, had a calming presence. She found a loose planked rocking chair and settled into it, her hands still and patient in her lap. Beatrice, the youngest, hovered near the fire, her gaze darting around the room, flinching at every creak of the old house. Isaac retreated to the barn, the familiar smell of hay and animal warmth a comfort to his frayed nerves. He tended to Pate and the milk cow, his chores a grounding rhythm in the midst of chaos. He stayed out there longer than he needed to, postponing the moment he would have to go back inside. What had he done? He had taken in 3 women he didn't know, 3 women who were the living embodiment of his public humiliation. He was a fool. When he finally forced himself to return to the house, the smell of food met him at the door. It was a smell he hadn't encountered in 5 years. Baking bread. He stopped in the doorway, stunned. Esther stood at the stove, stirring something in his largest pot. She had found his meager supplies: flour, salt pork, dried bean sand, was transforming them into a meal. She had found his mother's old sourdough starter, dormant in a crock at the back of the pantry, and brought it back to life. "I hope you don't mind," she said, not turning around. "We had to eat." "It's fine," he mumbled, taking a seat at the table, feeling like a guest in his own kitchen. They ate in near silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one Isaac was used to. It was not empty. It was filled with the small sounds of living, the clink of forks against plates, the soft sound of breathing, the crackle of the fire. Isaac ate the stew and the fresh, warm bread, and it was the best food he had tasted since Mary. He cut the thought off before it could fully form. After the meal, the sisters cleared the table and washed the dishes with an practiced, efficient harmony. Isaac watched them, a strange feeling taking root in his chest. It was not happiness. It was not hope. It was something more basic, a profound sense of dislocation, as if the world he had known for 5 years had tilted on its axis, and he was struggling to find his footing on this new, unfamiliar ground. That night, lying on the narrow cot in his study, he stared into the darkness and listened to the alien sound of soft feminine breathing coming from his bedroom, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Isaac would rise before dawn, as he always had, and find a fire already crackling in the hearth and the smell of coffee brewing. Esther was always the first one up, a sentinel in the quiet gloom of the morning, her movements sure and economical in the small kitchen. She would hand him a tin mug of coffee without a word, a simple gesture that began to feel like a ritual, a truce. He had expected them to be a burden, 3 helpless city women marooned on the prairie. He could not have been more wrong. The Donovan sisters were anything but helpless. They had a resilience born of long hardship, a practical knowledge that astonished him. They did not wait to be asked. They saw what needed to be done, and they did it. Esther, the eldest, took over the house with the quiet authority of a general. Within a week, the layers of dust that had coated every surface were gone. The windows were washed, letting in a brighter, cleaner light. She mended Isaac's worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She organized the pantry, took inventory of their dwindling supplies, and baked bread that filled the house with a scent of life that Isaac had long forgotten. She was the anchor, her steady presence a counterbalance to the chaos of their arrival. Matilda, the quiet one with the gentle eyes, revealed a surprising affinity for the outdoors. She was unafraid of the animals, her calm demeanor soothing the skittish chickens and the wary milk cow. Isaac watched from the barn one afternoon as she spoke in low, crooning tones to the cow, who had been cantankerous with him for weeks. Under Matilda's patient hand, the animal stood placidly, chewing its cud. She began tending to Mary's neglected kitchen garden, a patch of earth Isaac hadn't been able to bring himself to touch. She weeded and tilled with a slow, methodical strength, her broad back bent to the task. She seemed to draw a quiet contentment from the soil itself. Beatrice, the youngest and most timid, possessed a different kind of magic. She had a knack for finding beauty in the stark landscape. She would return from short walks with her apron full of wildflowers, which she arranged in old jam jars, placing them on the mantel and the kitchen table. These small, bright splashes of color were a startling intrusion in the monochrome world Isaac had built. One evening, he found her on the porch, a piece of charcoal in her hand, sketching the setting sun on a piece of scrap wood. She saw him and tried to hide it, her face flushing with embarrassment, but he had already seen the image, a sky full of fire and shadow, captured with a raw, untutored talent. He saw the prairie through her eyes for a moment, and it looked less like an enemy. Their presence changed the landscape of his days. He still worked from sunup to sundown, but he was no longer working against the silence. He was working towards the promise of a warm meal, a clean house, the low murmur of conversation he was not yet a part of, but was adjacent to. The house was no longer a tomb, it was occupied. Conversation, when it came, was sparse and functional. "The well pump is sticking," he'd announced to the room at large. "I'll look at it," Esther would reply. Or Matilda would quietly inform him, "The grey hen is sitting on a clutch of eggs." They circled each other cautiously, their interactions defined by the shared work of survival. The turning point, the first real crack in the wall of Isaac's reserve, came during a storm, not a blizzard, but a furious late-spring thunderstorm that rolled in without warning. The sky turned a sickly green-black, and the wind howled like a grieving animal. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the yard into a sea of mud. Isaac was in the barn, securing a loose section of the roof, when a bolt of lightning struck a cottonwood tree near the corral. The crack was deafening, a sound like the sky splitting in two. His first instinct was to run for the house, for safety. But Pate, his old gelding, was terrified, rearing and kicking against his stall, his eyes wide with panic. As Isaac struggled to calm the horse, the barn door slammed open, and Matilda stood there, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face. "The chickens!" she yelled over the roar of the storm. The coop door blew open. He hadn't even thought of the chickens. They would scatter and drown or be taken by predators in the chaos. Without a word, they both ran out into the deluge. They spent the next 20 minutes slipping and sliding in the mud, herding the terrified, squawking birds back into the coop. It was a ridiculous, frantic ballet in the pouring rain. At one point, Matilda slipped and landed hard in a puddle, and when Isaac helped her up, her face streaked with mud, she was laughing, a real, deep, unrestrained laugh. The sound was so alien, so unexpected, that it stopped him in his tracks. He stared at her, and a smile tugged at the corner of his own mouth, a rusty, unfamiliar movement. They got the last chicken inside and latched the door, then stood for a moment under the small overhang of the barn, breathing heavily, soaked and filthy. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Matilda just nodded, her smile fading into a gentle warmth. "They are good layers," she said simply, as if that explained everything. Later that evening, as they all sat around the fire, drying out, the atmosphere had changed. The shared crisis had acted as a solvent, dissolving some of the awkwardness between them. Beatrice was sketching in her corner, Esther was darning a sock, Matilda was humming softly. Isaac found himself speaking without thinking first. "My father taught me how to set a roof," he said into the quiet. "He said a man's character is like his roof. If it has holes, everything he's trying to protect underneath gets ruined." The sisters looked at him. It was the first time he had volunteered a piece of himself, a piece of his past, that wasn't directly related to the farm's immediate needs. Esther put down her sewing. "Our father was a bookseller," she said, her voice soft. "He believed a person's character was like a library. The more stories you took in, the richer you became. He didn't prepare us for this." She gestured vaguely at the room, the prairie outside the window. "But you learned," Isaac said, looking from her to Matilda to Beatrice. "You all learned." "We had to," Esther said, and in those 3 words he heard a lifetime of hardship, of being passed over, of relying on no one but each other. He began to see them then, not as 3 parts of a whole, but as individuals forged in the same fire. He saw Esther's fierce, protective strength, born of necessity. He saw Matilda's deep, quiet resilience, a bedrock of calm in the storm. He saw Beatrice's fragile, determined search for beauty in a world that had shown her little of it. He was beginning to see past the cruel caricature Henderson had intended. Their size, which had been the first and only thing he'd noticed on the train platform, was becoming secondary to their substance. These were women of immense character, of immense heart. The space they took up in his house was nothing compared to the space they were beginning to fill in the vast, echoing emptiness of his life. Lying on his cot that night, listening to the rain gently drumming on the roof he had fixed, Isaac felt the hard knot of grief in his chest loosen, just a little. It was a terrifying feeling, like thawing after being frozen. It hurt, but it was, he realized, the first real feeling he'd had in a very long time. The new equilibrium on the farm was a fragile thing, a tender new shoot pushing up through hard-packed earth. The unspoken arrangement held, solidified by shared work and the quiet respect that was growing between them. Yet, the outside world and its judgments could not be kept at bay forever. The farm was an island, but the town of Providence was the mainland, and eventually a boat had to be sent ashore. Their supplies were running low. Isaac dreaded the trip. Going to town had always been an ordeal. Now, it felt like walking into an ambush. He knew what awaited him. Henderson's sneering questions, the gawking stares, the whispers that would follow him down the dusty street. He considered sending one of the sisters, but the thought was immediately repulsive. He would not subject them to that humiliation alone. He was the man of the house, for better or worse. This was his burden to carry. "I'm going into town," he announced one morning over breakfast. 3 pairs of eyes snapped to his. A sudden tension filled the kitchen. "We need flour, salt, coffee," he continued, listing the items as if it were any other trip. "I'll come with you," Esther said at once. It wasn't a question. "No," Isaac said, more sharply than he intended. "I'll go alone." "Mr. Prescott," she said, her voice low but unyielding, "we are not children to be hidden away. We will not live in fear of a town of gossips. Whatever they have to say, they can say it to my face." Matilda and Beatrice murmured their assent, a quiet but firm chorus of support. He looked at them, at the resolve in their faces. He had been trying to protect them, but he saw now that his protection was also a form of erasure, of shame. They were right. Hiding would only validate the town's cruelty. It would make them complicit in Henderson's joke. "All right," he conceded, his voice gruff, "but we stay together." The journey into Providence felt different this time. Isaac sat on the wagon bench with Esther, just as he had on that first day. But now, the silence between them was not awkward, but companionable. In the back, Matilda and Beatrice spoke in low, steady tones, their nervousness betrayed only by the way they kept smoothing the fabric of their dresses. As they approached the town, Isaac felt a familiar tightening in his gut, but it was mixed with something new, a grim, protective determination. As they pulled onto the main street, it was as if a silent signal had gone out. Windows twitched with movement. People stopped their conversations to stare. It was exactly as he had feared. He felt Esther stiffen beside him, but her chin remained high. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Henderson's Mercantile, the very epicenter of their humiliation. "Wait here," he said, his voice low. He swung down from the wagon, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He could feel every eye on his back as he walked toward the store. The bell above the door jingled, announcing his arrival. Henderson was behind the counter, polishing a glass jar with a greasy rag. He looked up, and a slow, malicious grin spread across his face. "Well, well," he drawled, his eyes flicking past Isaac to the wagon outside. "Look what the cat dragged in," and he brought the whole litter with him. "Tell me, Prescott, how are you enjoying your family?" The store was empty of other customers, but Isaac knew that Henderson's clerks were listening from the back room. This was a performance. Isaac walked slowly to the counter, placing his hands flat on the wood. He leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper, but carrying the weight of cold fury. "Henderson," he said, "you are going to fill my order. You are going to give me a fair price, and you are never going to speak of me or the women in my care again. Not to my face, not behind my back. Do you understand me?" Henderson's grin faltered. He tried to puff out his chest to regain his footing. "Now hold on, Prescott. It was just a little fun. Can't you take a joke? A man orders one bride, gets 3 of the biggest sows I've ever seen. It's funny." The rage that Isaac had been tamping down for weeks finally broke free. He didn't shout, he didn't raise his fist. He simply reached across the counter, grabbed a fistful of Henderson's shirt, and pulled him forward until their faces were inches apart. Henderson's eyes went wide with shock and fear. "Those women," Isaac snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "have more decency and character in one finger than you have in your entire worthless body. They have turned my house into a home again. They have shown me kindness when all you have ever shown is spite. What you call a joke, Mr. Henderson, I am starting to think is the greatest blessing of my life. So you will keep your filthy mouth shut. If I ever hear you or anyone else in this town speak a single disrespectful word about them, I will come back here, and we will have a conversation that does not involve words." He released him with a shove. Henderson stumbled back against the shelves, knocking over a display of canned peaches. He was pale, his bravado gone, replaced by a sullen, resentful fear. Without another word, Isaac slapped his list down on the counter. "My order," he said, his voice flat and hard as granite. Silently, shakily, Henderson began to gather the items. Isaac stood there, unmoving, a silent guardian, until every bag of flour and pound of coffee was accounted for. When he carried the supplies out to the wagon, he felt as if he had just won a war. Esther, Matilda, and Beatrice were watching him, their expressions a mixture of awe and apprehension. He had defended them. He had publicly, unequivocally, taken their side. He had stood against the entire town and declared them his. As he loaded the last sack, the pastor, Mr. Hale, approached the wagon. He was a kind, elderly man who had presided over Mary's funeral. He had always treated Isaac with a gentle deference. "Isaac," he said, his eyes filled with a troubled concern as he looked from Isaac to the sisters, "there is talk." "Let them talk," Isaac said, his voice still rough. "It is not a respectable situation," Pastor Hale said gently. "A man living with 3 unmarried women. It is not right in the eyes of God or the community." Isaac turned to face him fully. He looked at the pastor, and then back at the 3 women in his wagon. He saw their quiet dignity, their strength. He felt the warmth that had seeped back into his life because of them. The choice was so clear, it was laughable. "Pastor," Isaac said, his voice softening but losing none of its resolve, "God has been absent from my house for 5 years. These women brought him back. They are my family now. If the community can't see the decency in that, then it's the community that isn't respectable, not us." He climbed back onto the wagon bench, picked up the reins, and clicked to Pate. He drove the wagon down the main street of Providence, not with his head down in shame, but with his head held high. Beside him, Esther Donovan sat just as tall. He had drawn a line in the sand. He had chosen his side. It was them against the world now. And as the town receded behind them, Isaac realized he didn't feel isolated at all. For the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was finally heading home. The confrontation in town had changed everything. It had been a declaration, not just to Henderson and the gossips, but to themselves. The unspoken arrangement was no longer unspoken. It was a fortress they now had to defend together. The journey back to the farm was quiet, but charged with a new energy. Isaac felt the lingering adrenaline of his anger, but underneath it was a bedrock of rightness, a sense of having finally done something that mattered. He had protected them, he had claimed them. But their newfound unity was about to be tested by a force far more powerful and indifferent than town gossip. The Dakota winter arrived not with a gentle drift of snow, but with a roar. The sky, which had been a crisp, clear blue for days, turned the color of a lead plate. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that escalated into a piercing shriek, carrying with it the first stinging pellets of ice. Isaac knew the signs. He had seen storms like this before. "Blizzard," he said, the single word hanging in the air of the warm kitchen. "It will be a bad one." Immediately, the four of them moved into action, a well-oiled machine born of weeks of shared labor. There was no panic, only a focused urgency. Isaac and Matilda headed for the barn. They had to bring in extra firewood, check the livestock, and secure every door and window against the coming onslaught. Esther and Beatrice worked inside, filling every available pot and bucket with water from the pump, checking the stores of food, and stuffing rags into the cracks around the window frames. The snow began to fall in earnest, thick and blinding, driven horizontally by the gale-force wind. Within an hour, the world outside the windows had vanished, replaced by a swirling, chaotic vortex of white. The temperature plummeted. The wind howled and clawed at the small house, rattling the shutters and seeming to seep through the very walls. They were utterly, completely isolated, a tiny ship of life in a raging, frozen sea. For 2 days they were prisoners in the house. The storm never relented. The wind was a constant, deafening scream, and the snow piled up in monstrous drifts against the doors and windows, plunging the house into a perpetual twilight. They kept the fire roaring, the warmth a fragile shield against the lethal cold that pressed in from all sides. They ate their meals, spoke in low voices, and listened to the fury of the storm. The shared danger forged a new kind of intimacy between them, a bond of mutual dependence that went deeper than words. Isaac found himself watching them, memorizing the way Beatrice's hand trembled as she added a log to the fire, the way Matilda would periodically go to the wall of the barn to press her ear against it, listening for the animals, the way Esther's face was a mask of calm, reassuring leadership, though he could see the strain in her eyes. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind's shriek lessened to a low, guttural moan. But it was then that they heard a new sound, a terrible, groaning crack from the direction of the barn, followed by a splintering crash that was audible even over the storm. Isaac's heart seized. "The roof," he breathed. He grabbed his heaviest coat and his lantern. "You can't go out there," Esther cried, grabbing his arm. "You'll be lost in seconds." "The animals," he said, his face grim. "If the roof has collapsed, they will freeze or be crushed." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for her to understand. The livestock was their future. Without them, they would not survive the rest of the winter. "Then we all go," Matilda said, her voice firm. She was already pulling on her own wraps. "You can't do it alone." It was madness. But looking at her determined face and at Beatrice, pale but resolute behind her, Isaac knew he couldn't stop them. He found a coil of rope. "We tie ourselves together," he commanded. "No one gets separated. We move from the house to the barn. We do not let go." He tied the rope around his waist, then Esther's, then Matilda's, and finally Beatrice's, a human chain against the apocalypse. Opening the door was a battle. A wall of snow and wind slammed into them. Isaac lowered his head and plunged into the white chaos, pulling the others behind him. The 10 yards to the barn felt like 10 miles. The wind stole their breath, and the snow blinded them. They were guided only by the rope and by Isaac's memory of the path. When they finally stumbled against the barn wall, they were gasping, their faces numb with cold. Inside, the scene was devastating. A massive section of the roof had given way under the weight of the snow, collapsing into the main part of the barn. Heavy beams and timbers lay in a tangled wreck. The wind and snow now had free entry, and the temperature inside was nearly as cold as it was outside. Pate was trapped, a heavy beam having fallen across his stall, pinning him. The milk cow was bellowing in terror, and the chickens were a frantic, squawking mass of feathers in the corner. For a moment, despair washed over Isaac. It was too much. The damage was too great. But then Matilda moved past him, murmuring to the cow, her calm voice cutting through the noise. Esther was already assessing the damage, her practical mind calculating the risks. "We have to free the horse," Isaac shouted over the wind. He grabbed a small hand axe and began chopping at the smaller timbers around the main beam. Matilda joined him, using her strength to pull away the debris. It was Beatrice who saw the real danger. "Isaac, look!" she screamed, pointing up. A huge, splintered section of the remaining roof was groaning under the pressure of the wind, swaying precariously right above them. It was going to come down at any moment. "Get back!" Isaac yelled, shoving Matilda away. But he knew they didn't have time. He put his shoulder to the main beam, pinning Pate, trying to leverage it, a desperate, impossible task. Then Esther was there, wedging a smaller plank into a gap, trying to create a fulcrum. Matilda threw her weight next to Isaac's. Even Beatrice, her fear forgotten, was there, pulling at smaller pieces, trying to help. They worked in a frantic, synchronized fury. The roof above them groaned again, a final, terrible sound of surrender. "Now!" Isaac roared. With one last, collective, superhuman effort, they heaved. The beam shifted. It moved just enough for Pate to scramble free, his leg bleeding but not broken. Isaac grabbed Beatrice and Matilda and threw them towards the relative safety of the intact section of the barn, just as the rest of the roof came down with a deafening crash, showering the spot where they had been standing with snow and heavy timbers. They lay there, huddled together in the semi-darkness, gasping for air, their bodies bruised, their lungs burning. They were alive. They had done it. In the chaotic aftermath, amidst the frightened lowing of the cow and the frantic clucking of the chickens, Isaac looked at the 3 women who had risked their lives alongside him. Their faces were smudged with dirt and pale with cold, but their eyes shone with a fierce, brilliant light. In that moment, in the heart of the wreckage, something inside Isaac finally broke open. It wasn't grief, it was love. It was a profound, overwhelming wave of love, so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. It was not the memory of his love for Mary, but something new, something alive and roaring like the storm outside. He loved Esther for her unshakable strength, the rock upon which they all stood. He loved Matilda for her deep, quiet compassion, her connection to the earth and its creatures. He loved Beatrice for her resilient spirit, her ability to find and create beauty in the midst of ruin. He loved them all, not as a replacement for what he had lost, but as the architects of what he had found. He had been sent 3 women as a cruel joke, and in the crucible of a Dakota blizzard, he had discovered that he had fallen in love with all of them, with the incredible, unbreakable family they had become. The storm broke as suddenly as it had begun. The wind died, and a profound, ringing silence fell over the land. The world that emerged was new, sculpted and purified by the snow. It was a landscape of breathtaking, brutal beauty, the sun glittering on drifts that were higher than the fences. The farm was a wreck, the barn half destroyed, the work ahead of them immense. But they were alive, and they were together. The days that followed were filled with the hardest labor Isaac had ever known. They worked from sunrise to sunset in the biting cold, shoveling snow, salvaging what they could from the ruined barn, and constructing a temporary shelter for the animals. The shared ordeal of the blizzard had stripped away any lingering formality or caution between them. They were a single unit, moving and working with an instinctual understanding of one another's strengths and needs. Isaac would catch himself watching them, a feeling of quiet wonder settling in his chest. He'd see Esther expertly splinting a broken timber, her brow furrowed in concentration. He'd watch Matilda calming Pate, her touch gentle but firm on the horse's injured leg. He'd see Beatrice, her fear of the outdoors conquered, diligently securing the canvas over the makeshift corral, her cheeks red from the cold. They were not the helpless women from the train platform. They were pioneers, as strong and resilient as any man he had ever known. They were survivors. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, they sat exhausted around the hearth. The house was an island of warmth and light in the vast, frozen darkness. Beatrice was asleep in her chair, a piece of charcoal held loosely in her hand. Matilda was staring into the flames, a soft, contented expression on her face. Esther was mending a tear in Isaac's coat, her stitches small and perfect. Isaac looked from one to the other, his heart full. The words had been building in him for days, and he knew he could not hold them back any longer. "Esther," he said, his voice quiet. She looked up, her needle pausing in mid-air. "Yes, Isaac." The sound of his first name from her lips was still new, a product of the storm's familiarity. He struggled to find the right words, the words to encompass the enormity of what had happened in his heart. "When you arrived," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I thought my life was over. I thought it was the end of everything." He looked down at his calloused hands. "This house was a grave. I was just a ghost living in it." He took a breath and looked at her, his gaze clear and direct. "You and your sisters, you brought it back to life. You brought me back to life. What that man Henderson meant as a curse has been the single greatest gift I have ever received." Tears welled in Esther's eyes, but she did not look away. She had seen the change in him, felt it in the way he looked at them, in the way he spoke. "We were just trying to survive, Isaac," she whispered. "Same as you." "No," he said, shaking his head. "It was more than that. In the storm, in the barn, I realized something." He paused, the truth of it both terrifying and liberating. "I realized I love you, all of you. Not like a man loves a bride, but like a man loves his family, like a man loves his home. You are my home now." A single tear traced a path down Esther's cheek. She reached out and placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm and firm. "We love you too, Isaac," she said, her voice thick with unshed emotion. "You gave us a home when we had none. You gave us respect when all we had ever known was ridicule. You are our family." In that moment, the last of the old grief in Isaac's heart finally gave way. It wasn't that the memory of Mary and his son was gone, but the pain was no longer a sharp, defining edge. It had softened, becoming a part of the man he was now, a man capable of holding both sorrow for what was lost and a profound, encompassing love for what had been found. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it was with a fierce, determined beauty. The snow melted, revealing the green promise of the earth beneath. The prairie came alive with wildflowers, and the air was sweet with the smell of damp soil and new beginnings. They rebuilt the barn, stronger than it was before. Isaac and the sisters worked side by side, their shared laughter echoing in the clear spring air. Matilda's garden flourished, producing a bounty of vegetables that filled their table. Beatrice's sketches filled the walls of the house, vibrant portraits of the farm, the animals, and the faces of her family. Esther managed their growing enterprise with a sharp mind and a steady hand, turning the farm from a place of mere subsistence into one of genuine prosperity. The town of Providence eventually, grudgingly, came to accept the strange family on the Blackwood stretch. They saw the fruits of their labor, the health of their livestock, the quiet dignity with which they conducted themselves. The whispers did not cease entirely, but they were tempered with a new, reluctant respect. They were no longer a joke, they were a success. One warm summer evening, Isaac stood on the porch, looking out at the land. It was the same land that had once seemed so empty and menacing. Now, it looked different. It looked full. He could hear the low murmur of the sisters' voices from the kitchen, the clatter of plates as they prepared the evening meal. The scent of baking bread wafted through the open door. Pate nickered softly from the new corral. This was his world. It was not the life he had planned, not the future he had once dreamed of. It was something stranger, harder, and infinitely more beautiful. Beatrice came out to join him, pressing a cup of cool water into his hand. Matilda and Esther followed, and the four of them stood there together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. There were no more questions about their arrangement, no more uncertainty about the future. They had faced judgment and hardship and the very fury of nature itself, and they had not just survived. They had thrived. Isaac Prescott, the lonely farmer, looked at the three extraordinary women who had become his entire world. The cruelest joke the world could conjure had led him to the deepest love he had ever known. He had been sent three sisters, and in them he had found everything: a family, a purpose, and a home. And as the first stars began to appear in the vast Dakota sky, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was the luckiest man alive.